Hey, good afternoon, Margie. Could I do a quick mic check? Can you hear me okay?
Yep, Ben, we've got, I see your smiling face and hear your cheerful voice. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. I show it's 1 o'clock Mountain Daylight Time. It's April 23rd, 2025. And on behalf of the GridWorks team, myself, Margie Tatro, Kathy Boyes, and Deborah Shields, we'd like to welcome you to the fourth workshop of the EPE Integrated Resource Planning Stakeholder Conversations. This workshop is being recorded, so it could be available at a later date for folks who want to view it. And the link to the recording will be posted on the GridWorks website along with a written summary of this particular workshop. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And we'd also like to offer a huge thanks to our working relationship and the efforts by both EPE and E3 in preparing the materials and the conversation for this workshop. So with the next slide, let me just describe what our plan is for today. Our plan is, first of all, to allow a summary to be discussed by EPE and E3 of the model base case, inputs and assumptions, so that we all have a current understanding of what's going into that base case. Then we'll spend time talking about the stakeholder model related requests that have come in and that EPE and E3 have analyzed, processed, and have developed a path forward that like we would like to propose that for the stakeholders' consideration. So our agenda today, first of all, after the welcome and review of where we are in the entire process, we will hear from EPE and E3 on the base case assumptions and inputs. We'll have time for questions and answers. We will then hear from the same group on the model related requests that came in and the proposed disposition of those requests. We'll take a quick break and then we will have some more question and answer time on the model run requests. And we at GridWorks would like to take the temperature of all the stakeholders on the call at that point about how are you feeling about the proposal for dealing with those model related requests that have come in. We'll summarize and describe the next steps to get ready for really understanding model outputs that will be part of some future workshops, and we'll adjourn by 4 p.m. So with that, let's start with the next slide to show just a reminder again, as we have in previous workshops, please hold your questions until the Q&A sessions. And as you have all been doing along, continue to be respectful in your comments. Recognize we're working this in a collaborative sense, and so we greatly appreciate everyone's efforts so far in being collaborative in the conversation and constructive. Please continue to share your ideas and leave time for others. So those are our norms for the workshop. Deb, if you'd go to the next slide, please. Wanted to review this big picture of the stakeholder engagement process that began with all of us in workshops 1 and 2, covering some basic information, building a shared knowledge base so that we could understand the challenges, the opportunities, the requirements that the utility is dealing with in this very rapidly changing time of energy infrastructure. We talked a lot about what goes into those considerations. We talked about scenario design, regulatory requirements, sensitivities, and we gathered on the order of 26 model inputs and requests from stakeholders, which have now been looked at, and we have a proposed path forward for handling those. So now the utility team is going into very serious and hardcore modeling activities, such that when we get to the far right-hand side of this chart where we're evaluating the results of those models, coming up with a discussion of the statement of need of the quantity and type of resources that will be needed over the next 20 years. Also the action plan, ideas for what the utility might consider as actions in the next 3 years as part of this plan will be part of our later workshops. So just a reminder to remind everybody where we are in the process. We're really in the heart, the middle of this diagram in the modeling discussions. So Deb, if you'd go to the next slide, please. I will now turn the podium over to the EPE and E3 team. Just to remind folks, we will first hear about the base case inputs and assumptions. We've got 45 minutes scheduled for the presentation by EPE, and then we will have 25 minutes for questions and answers. We would like to ask you to hold your questions until then. If you see a slide where you need a clarification or you want to come back into the Q&A, feel free to take note of the page number, the slide number, so it will be easy to refer to when the Q&A session begins. If for some reason we run out of time for all the questions and answers on this topic, we will ask you to put any remaining questions into the chat so that we can document them and get back to you with responses. So just a reminder, this first segment will be please hold your questions. Please take note of slides that you might want to come back to. And then for the second part, we'll come back and discuss the modeling run request summary. We'll have 30 minutes for that discussion and then a quick break. Then we will come back after the break and talk about the proposed process for dealing with those model requests. And we will take a quick poll using Zoom to see how much agreement there is in that path forward. So with that, Kathy, is there anything that you think we need to add before we turn over to Emmanuel and the EPE team?
Not for me, thank you.
Okay, great. Are there any questions from anybody on the phone about process of what we're trying to accomplish and our process for today's workshop? Okay, seeing none, I would like to turn the floor over to Emmanuel Villalobos from EPE to help us all get up to date on the base case model inputs and assumptions, and then we'll handle questions and answers by show of hands after the presentation is completed by EPE. Emmanuel, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Margie. Great works team. Quick reminder, Emmanuel Villalobos with El Paso Electric, Director for Market Development and Resource Strategy. And thank you everyone for joining us on our stakeholder engagement meeting number 4. Next one. This is our quick agenda. You're gonna see our standard safe harbor statement. We're gonna go through a quick overview of where we've been so far. We'll touch on some of the loads and resources terms that we've been building on over the last couple of meetings. We'll start to get into the base case inputs and assumptions, and then we'll transition over to E3, diving into the nitty-gritty of the modeling. The next slide. So here you've seen this slide before. Like I said, we are at workshop 4. We are right in the middle of the IRP modeling results section. So we are halfway there. We've done it. We made it. So we can go on to the next slide. So we presented this slide in the past as well. This is just to illustrate the importance of your loads and resources table and how this entire planning process is really a balancing act between your planned resources, your existing resources, their contribution to your system at time of peak versus all of the different types of demand that you're trying to balance out and you're trying to find that happy medium. Go to the next slide. So this here is a simplified version of our loads and resources table. You all have seen versions of these tables presented in the last couple of meetings. This one here is specific to EPE's system as a whole. The first line there, you see the total accredited capacity that is based off of our ELCC values that we've talked about in the past. You see your firm load obligations, our reserve margins. Just as a reminder, again, our total planning reserves as of right now are set at 9% going through 2029. That is set to increase to 11% in 2030. The reason for that is the 11%, which is calculated off of a 1 in 10 loss of load event calculation, is the industry standard, or where the industry is moving towards. So we are moving towards that same standard. Taking your planning reserve margin into account, we can calculate our total capacity need, and then subtracting your accredited capacity from your capacity need, you can see our position there, the bottom row. Red means that we are capacity short. So that is part and parcel of what this whole process is for, is identifying, building our model, identifying what it is that we need to do to address your resource adequacy and how you can meet your firm load obligations, and trying to figure out what the next steps are or what plans you need to enact. Moving on from this system LNR view, this here is the same basic information, just shown differently. You can see the different types of capacity that we have: our nuclear, our gas generation, followed by your solar, battery, and then ultimately your demand response. What you can see here is you see the increase in your capacity. Again, this is just based off of your ELCC. So you can see the increase in your capacity, your available capacity for the first couple of years. You see that because of the resources that EPE selected in the last couple of RFPs that we've done, the 2021 and 2023 RFPs. But you notice quickly after 2030, you start to see a decline in your capacity. That's because, again, as we've mentioned in the past, EPE has aging generation, and you start to see a lot of our generation retirements. So as time goes on, we are noticing a steady increase in our load. So that's natural growth, residential growth. But you also see that decrease in our generation resources, and that is increasing that gap for our capacity need. So you can see there your firm load obligation. On top of that, you see your reserve margin, and that capacity need is the difference between your actual capacity and your load plus your reserve margin. Now, this here is the same basic table, but specific to New Mexico. So we focus on the accredited capacity for resources that are directed towards New Mexico. You take your load obligations, and those are that ultimately is your resource position, your capacity needs. So you can see, as you're looking at it just from the New Mexico point of view, we will be short on resources. One thing I do want you all to keep in mind is that EPE does dispatch its system on a system basis. So this is not emblematic or just of how New Mexico is going to be affected. We do dispatch for both jurisdictions together, but we do want to show that New Mexico does have an increasing need because of its steady load growth. It does have an increasing need in capacity. Again, this is the same slide as the one that we just showed, except it's specific to New Mexico. And you do see those same trends where you see generation retiring over time, and your steady load growth, your steady growth from New Mexico, increasing that gap between growth and capacity and creating that capacity need. So here we can jump into your modeling base case and assumptions. I'll hit on a couple of these higher level topics, and then we'll transition you guys over to E3. So this slide here is really just a comparison of what goes into our Plexos model. Again, for reminding, the Plexos is the modeling software that EP has that we use for this type of resource planning. So this is the comparison between what goes into the model, your inputs, versus what outputs you receive from the model. So it's everything that we've talked about in the last couple of meetings when we've been building that joint knowledge pool with you all. We've talked about our candidate resources, existing resources, your available transmission, build costs, everything that goes into your generation attributes, fuel pricing, market pricing, system reliability requirements. These are all basically building the EPE system within the model so that we can start to get your optimal portfolio, what resources, installed capacities, what you're going to need, new, existing, or planned, I should say, capacity out in future years. The model will kick out your optimal portfolio with its associated portfolio costs. You can dive down into detail in that model so you can take out capital, operational costs, fixed costs. On to the next slide, please. So now we're going to talk a little bit about our base case and our load forecast. Here again, this is similar to what you saw in the earlier slides where I was talking about the LNR. This is your load growth over time. This is provided by our load forecasting team. Again, this just shows that we have steady growth in El Paso for, through 2045 and beyond. Something to kick out here or pay special attention to there are assumptions within the model for things like electrification. You can see that in the EV load forecast portion at the very top. You can see that we are forecasting increase in EVs. You also see your offsets to load, your energy efficiency programs, and your distributed generation. So you'll see that at the bottom of the graph here. You can see that from 2026, we're estimating about 2.4% in our system, going all the way up to 13.5% in 2045. So we are forecasting that type of load growth in energy efficiency in our DG. Same chart again, but again, drilled down specific to New Mexico. And you do see that for our New Mexico forecast or expectations, we are seeing a, I guess, percent-wise larger increase in that energy efficiency and distributed generation numbers, where we're going from 3.7% in 2026 all the way up to 20% by 2045. Now, no, it's fine. Thank you. Just one thing that I wanted you all to note is that the note at the bottom of these charts, all inputs and assumptions are draft. What that means is that we don't have final results of the model yet because we are still engaging in this process with you all, building what different scenarios. But it really is just a focus on there are some inputs that go into the system or into the model that are continuously being updated, like your load forecast, fuel pricing, or market pricing. Those are items where you want to have the latest and greatest information, so you can update those as the model building goes forward so that you use the best available information when you have it. To the next slide. So here we'll transition a little over to your resource capacity. Let's talk a little bit more about our existing and planned resources. So again, the nice thing about the LNR tables, like we showed earlier, is that it combines all of the information here that you've seen in the last couple of slides. So this one is slightly different because it's not looking at our affected load carrying capability, our accredited capacity. It's looking at installed capacity, or some also call it nameplate capacity. So you see the different types of generation, but what I want you all to look at specifically here on these slides is what I mentioned earlier about the effects on future retirements within our system. So you can see the 2023, that increase is because of our RFP resource additions. And then you slowly start to see after 2030, 2031, you start to see that we have some generation retiring. For example, in 2031, you see our copper gas plant retiring. You see our Roadrunner solar facility retirement. I really find that interesting because that'll show you that EPE's been in the solar game for almost 20 years now, that we actually have our first solar facility retiring in a couple of years. And then you'll see that just continuing on, our gas units, Newman 3 and 4, retiring in 2031. Our Rio Grande 8 retiring in 2033. That's another gas plant. That one is located in New Mexico. We're also going to see Macho Springs. That is one of our larger, currently larger solar facilities. That's 50 megawatt solar facility. That'll be retiring in 2033. And then the trend continues as some of these aging generation starts to get out there. You'll see further retirements 2030, 2045 and beyond. Same thing here, but breaking it up for specific to the New Mexico allocation. As we've mentioned in the past, New Mexico makes up 20 to 22% of EP's total system. And this is just that breakout, same thing of your different resource types and how your resource retirements are affecting them over time. So now we'll touch a little bit on our system topology. Your system topology is, think about it as the geographical representation of your system within the actual Plexos model. So that is one of the hurdles that the analysts undertake here, or one of the challenges, is how to best represent or build your model. You build your system into this complex model. You've seen this map before. Our people call it our shoehorn shaped territory. Some people call it the pork chop. But our system does stretch from Hatch, New Mexico to Van Horn, Texas. I believe it's a 10,000 square mile service territory. What I like about this map is you can see the different gas plants. You can see our different existing solar facilities. And then way far out left, you'll see our Palo Verde ownership out in Phoenix, Arizona, or outside of Phoenix. And with that, I will pass this over to E3. I believe that's going to be Nate.
Excellent. Thank you, Emmanuel. Again, maybe just while I jump in here, I've seen some questions come in, and we'll take some questions at the end of the presentation verbally, as Margie noted. Yeah, so Emmanuel was describing kind of the existing service territory. However, as we move towards kind of how we represent this within a Plexos model, we have to think about kind of what is possible within our energy system model and what we can computationally achieve for capacity expansion modeling. So we've represented EPE's system through a set of zones that aggregate kind of EPE's load and resources. So you can see kind of Las Cruces, and then kind of the zones that make up the El Paso area, and then out to the Far East and out to Sierra Blanca. Also, kind of in this bubble and lines map that you see here, each of these bubbles kind of represents that kind of aggregated set of loads or nodes on the system, and the resources contained within those, and then kind of a bulk transfer capability within between each of these zones. And then externally, we're also representing Path 47, which is EPE's external ties to the Palo Verde generation share that is owned by EPE, and then also kind of the Palo Verde market hub, or kind of the hub to EPE's west. So the system will represent these, the load, the resources. Future resources will also be represented respectively, kind of where they could be added to the system. And then also we have aligned upgrade costs that can happen. So upgrades are available between each of these zones. And those costs range from a lower cost to a higher cost, depending on what the land use or kind of complications could be for additional lines between zones. So just flagging here kind of what EPE's system topology looks like as a representation of the broader service territory of EPE. One thing to note here, this is pretty forward leaning, I think, for EPE in terms of moving from an IRP modeling process to this integrated system, or ISP modeling, as we're now representing not just resource expansion, we're also thinking about resource expansion in conjunction or in tandem with our system or transmission line expansion. So forward leaning there, and I would say that also opens up EPE to explore a little bit more proactively what are the transmission implications of some of these expansion plans or portfolios. Other systems or utilities may still be using just a single node that represents all load and all resources. So just want to flag EPE is not only about to retire their first solar plant in the 2030s, but also pushing forward on the kind of integrated system planning modeling here. Thanks. Next slide. Great. So jumping into some of the resource assumptions for our base case modeling. And first is, as Emmanuel noted, one of the major concerns within resource planning, and then especially for EPE with load growth and resource retirements, is the reliability of the system. And we measure kind of the contribution to this reliability, as you'll recall from our previous conversations, through the effective load carrying capability, or the ELCC, of our resources. So we evaluate this to just really understand how can that resource actually contribute in those real peak hours of need or stress on the system, and how well does that align? So for example, you might build a lot of solar, but if that solar never is available when your peak or most stressful hours are, it may not have the highest ELCC. So we did run some ELCC modeling together with EPE to update their ELCCs and planning reserve margin, as we had noted in previous conversations, and showing here kind of where we're at on EPE system for solar and storage ELCC as we add more resources. So first thing I want to flag here is the solar ELCC. It may be a little bit lower than what you've seen in other utilities that maybe are just growing their solar portfolio. EPE has over 2 gigawatts or 2,000 megawatts we're seeing here of solar on the system by 2030, meaning that it has extensive portfolio, and that portfolio is starting to push where those problematic or peak hours are till later in the evening, and those just do not align with kind of where solar resource availability is. So that means the ELCC is kind of pushed down as we, saturate the system with more solar resources. So ELCCs are probably around, or incremental ELCCs are around 20%, falling to maybe 17 to 12% as we get to around 3,000 megawatts on the EP system. Same is true for storage. As we add more, we saturate the system and the ELCC drops. But we don't have as much storage on the system as right now on EP's system, and we're adding more, through the RFP they've run in 2024, as Emmanuel showed. So those 4-hour batteries are still suitable kind of to dispatch during those net peak hours that are being shifted later into the evening, as I noted. But we're seeing some saturation effects, meaning, it's getting to about 50% or lower, or 25% capacity factor in those first 2,000 megawatts of installed capacity you see here. So that's kind of seeing some saturation. So at some point, we'll need on the EPE system, we'll need to move to longer storage durations. So maybe from 4-hour to an 8-hour, to mitigate that loss in effective capacity. Great. Next slide. So also just want to talk about wind. Oh yeah, if we go back one slide, I'll just flag. We are showing the incremental ELCC separately here, and that is just to kind of understand visually where these are going in terms of their incremental ELCCs, showing kind of a surface which does capture the interactive effect, or the additional gains of ELCC when we have solar and storage together on the system, is a little harder for us to just visually understand. So we show that separately here, but we are using a surface that does reflect those interactive effects, and that is in the system model. So just want to flag that as well here. Next slide. Yep, so wind ELCC. First, I'll just flag on the right here is a graph, right, of our ELCCs on the y-axis, on the vertical, and then across the horizontal, our nameplate capacity again. And we can see here that as we add incremental capacity, our ELCCs are again falling, meaning that we're kind of using that resource, and it's shifting our problematic hours to another time where that ELCC or that resource may not be available. But again, wind ELCCs, I'll flag, are significantly higher than our solar ELCCs, and kind of rightfully staying high as we add this first kind of 1,400 megawatts onto the system. So what that means is, EPE has had a lot of solar in the system, and that penetration is kind of saturating that ELCC curve. But wind is somewhat new to EPE's portfolio. There's nothing connected, or there's less resources connected also in the region. So I think this kind of shifts the ELCCs a little bit higher, and they'll get a little bit more value in those first 1,000 megawatts in terms of ELCC. We are looking at 3 different resource capacity factors here, so something kind of close that maybe has around a 40% up to about 50% when we're looking up further to the northeast of from El Paso. So up towards Albuquerque as we get into those higher capacity factor wind profiles or resources. And so the model will see all 3 of these resources, as we said before, reflecting some transmission interconnection costs to get to those more distant resources. Great. Next slide. Great. So moving on to the base case, we are looking at 3 natural gas prices that go into EPE system model, depending on the resources and their location and contracts. What we're showing here is kind of the annual average of those 3, which are actually broken down in the model to more of a monthly resolution. But we're just showing the kind of annual average price here to show the trend, of cost of fuel rising from around $3 per MMBTU out to about $5 over the next 20 years. And I'll say here that we're just showing the base case assumptions here. There will likely be some sensitivities on fuel prices, as we typically do in these energy system models that are dependent on fuel price. Next slide. Also here, I'm showing in the base case, our EPE system model assumes, a connection to the Palo Verde kind of market hub. So assuming some day ahead market energy prices or kind of unspecified market purchases to the east, to the west, sorry. And so this is also just showing the trend, rising from about $40 per megawatt hour on an annual average to about $70 in the next 20 years, just kind of reflecting resource costs and the resource portfolio, from the market to the west of EPE over the next 20 years. And again, we actually have in the model hourly prices for this, and they're based on E3 kind of proprietary modeling of the system and forward-looking market prices, and we can share kind of those annual averages here, just to get a glimpse of kind of where they're going. Great. All right. Stepping forward in our base case. So we've talked about what the system topology looks like, so how we've mapped out EPE's system. Emmanuel talked a little bit about what our load looks like and our resources on that system. And I've also talked about kind of how different wind, solar storage can contribute to some of our reliability needs. So now also we just want to talk about what candidate resources the model is able to add to the system in our base case. So want to bring everybody back to kind of our planning example here, where we're looking at our baseline resources here in kind of the black, a very illustrative kind of planning reserve margin resource need graph that is very similar to what Emmanuel was showing with that capacity need in his previous slides. So that green stack of the bar here is kind of that incremental system resource need that is growing as our load and reliability requirements or reserve margin is growing out into the future due to load growth. And then we see our existing or baseline resources being retired. So our incremental system resource need is growing. And this is kind of the need that we need to fill with investments or, in our modeling activity through our kind of capacity expansion, minimized cost portfolio. Next slide. So candidate resources. The first group that I'll talk about quickly here are just the renewables, which we typically look at on a levelized cost of energy basis, so $1 per megawatt hour through the horizon. And I'm only looking at the base case resources here. So I know that a lot of us will have questions about the resources you thought you would see, and we'll bring those to our discussions as we start to talk about those other scenarios where we have new and emerging technologies. But what we're looking at here is really the base case scenario resources, which are what EPE could expect to be able to acquire in an RFP over the next few years as they start to procure these resources. So in the near term. So we're looking at utility PV, our solar resource here in yellow, our wind resources in blue, and a geothermal in kind of a reddish brown. And what we're looking at here is the nominal cost $1 per megawatt hour over the horizon 2025 to 2045. And included here are assumptions on PTC. So I will flag that and understanding that there's some uncertainty there and that we will likely have to do some uncertainty, exploration. So some sensitivity analysis on resource costs later on in our modeling activity. But for our baseline cost projections, we're looking at, up to about $35 per megawatt hour for solar, which drops significantly down to almost $10 by 2045. And then our wind, depending on the capacity factor that's shown here, 40 to 50%, ranges from around $20 to $30 per megawatt hour and dropping over the horizon. I'll flag here that there is a break in our vertical axis, just to show kind of how much more expensive on a megawatt hour basis our geothermal resource might be compared to some of these more economic renewables, wind and solar. So geothermal is on $1 per megawatt hour basis up above $100 per megawatt hour. and likely increasing given this projection over the horizon. So all of these costs that you see here, and in the next slide, I'll just flag also are from E3 proprietary forecasts, which are based majorly on the 2024 or latest annual technology baseline from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which is kind of an industry standard cost forecast. But E3 does do some adjustments to just reflect some of the more recent costs being seen in the market. And all of these costs, including what I'm showing now with the levelized fixed costs, are for generic new resource cost assumptions. These are not RFP bid resources that E3 is, I mean, EPE is lining up for each of these years. It's just generic cost forecasts. And any actual procurement costs by EPE will be kind of based on the outcome of a subsequent RFP. So the cost will be kind of firmed up at that point. So here just showing the same figure, but now we're looking at levelized fixed cost, since we're talking about our thermal resources and storage, which offer more of a capacity to the grid than that economic energy. So looking at what we have here, we have our gas CT and our gas CCGT stacked up, around 150 to $200 per megawatt or per kilowatt year. Staying somewhat level, rising slightly over the horizon. And the same storage, we're looking at just under 300 for 8-hour storage, and just around 225 or under 250 for 4-hour, with minimal decreases going forward. And these do reflect kind of the ITC assumptions. Next slide. I think we're at the end of kind of just the overview of the base case inputs and assumptions. So I'll hand it back to the GridWorks team to kind of facilitate discussions and next steps.
Great. Thanks, Emmanuel and Nate. I have one question, and then we'd like to ask people to raise your hands if you have questions. I'm going to ask that we not put those in the chat at this point, but have people raise their hand and ask one question at a time. But let me ask, the first question is a clarification, Emmanuel and Nate. Though you've described some inputs and assumptions that are for the entire EPE system and some considerations that are for the New Mexico specific system, and Emmanuel pointed out that the system is dispatched as a whole, is your modeling effort looking at the system as a whole or looking at the New Mexico specific resources? Could you please make sure stakeholders understand what the modeling is considering?
I'll let EPE take the first response there.
Yeah, the model looks at both. So it's I guess a tiered approach where we solve for the individual jurisdictional needs as well as the system as a whole overall.
Okay, good. Thank you. And this is important because when we get to talking about statement of need, the statement of need for the IRP will be focused on the New Mexico specific resources, right? Okay. Thank you, Emmanuel.
Margie, sorry, just before you ask the questions from stakeholders, can I maybe just make a suggestion?
Yeah.
Just been monitoring the chat here as it's coming in. There's some questions that are related to ELCC values. I do have some additional slides just from other presentation work E3 has done in the past that I think could help facilitate some of those answers. So if I can maybe make a suggestion, maybe we group all of the ELCC questions together, if anyone has some, and maybe Michelle can share a couple of slides that I just sent her.
Yeah, that sounds like a good place to start. Ben, are you you want to do that now before we take questions from on other topics? I think that would be great.
Let me just check with Michelle first if she received that presentation, and if so, if she's able to share her screen. Wonderful.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. So there was just a couple of questions that I saw coming on the chat, and I thought these slides may help answer those questions. So I think Jim asked a question on why does penetration or saturation of storage decrease its value from an ELCC perspective. And I think this graph on the bottom of the screen here on the left-hand side really demonstrates its impact pretty well here. So essentially, if you look on this load graph here on the bottom left, and you see if you were to add 4-hour storage, which is the darkest purple shaded area, you can see essentially what the storage is doing is it's flattening the load curve, right? But when you then come down to the next reliability hours, so the kind of the second shade of purple here, the length of storage or the duration of the storage resource needs to become longer in order for it to provide additional reliability impacts. So to Jim's question, it's not necessarily a case of increasing the penetration of storage decreases its value. What we're actually saying is as you increase the penetration of storage, you need longer duration storage incrementally for it to continue to provide additional value. And I think there was a follow-up question from Cynthia in the chat that said, okay, well, when do you switch from 4-hour to 8-hour storage? And the answer to that is pretty simple. At one point in time, or one point in penetration levels, the cost of storage for 4-hour storage will become more expensive on an accredited capacity basis than the cost of 8-hour storage. And at that point, you will start building 8-hour storage instead of 4-hour storage. Now, just to be clear, on a nameplate basis, the 4-hour storage is always going to be lower cost. But when you look at its accredited capacity, it will flip and become more expensive. So I'll just pause there real quickly. Jim, Cynthia, did that answer those two questions?
Hi, this is Jim, and yeah, thank you for that clarification and that understand better now. Thank you.
Wonderful. And Cynthia, did I answer your question there?
Thank you. Let me get off mute. And so then is that illustrated, say, for example, in slide 32, which is the levelized fixed cost of 4-hour and 8-hour?
It's not illustrated there because those cost streams on that slide are on a nameplate basis.
Okay, and you said it's otherwise on an equivalent capacity basis.
Yeah, what you would have to do is you would essentially adjust that cost that you see on the slide that Nate was presenting to calculate an accredited capacity cost.
Okay.
And at one point, because the ELCC value of 4 hours storage is declining, it's going to become more expensive on an accredited capacity basis, and it would be overtaken by the cost of 8-hour storage.
Right. Well, and I guess my question also was, when do you see that happening? Do you know yet?
We won't know until we start seeing the model. And when we start seeing the modeling results that would be presenting in the next meeting, we should hopefully see that flip, sometime in the early 2030s. It should hopefully become pretty obvious.
Okay, thank you, Ben.
I see. Thank you. Ben, is there anything else you wanted to offer at this point before I open it up to raised hands of the stakeholders?
There was just one more slide if we go down to slide 11 on this presentation. Sorry, maybe slide 12. Here we go. So Cynthia, another question I saw come up in the chat was, why do you treat demand response as a resource as opposed to a load reduction? The answer to that is quite simple, is demand response is not a perfect resource. So demand response has limitations in terms of the duration of calls, the number of calls, the seasonality of when demand response can be implemented. So there are restrictions on demand response. So it is not a perfect resource, the same way as storage is not, the same way as gas is not. So we treat demand response as a resource in which we calculate an effective load carrying capacity for demand response. So essentially it's treated on an even keel to all other potential resources.
Okay, thank you, Ben.
Absolutely. Then just one last on slide 10 on this presentation. There was another question I saw in the chat, something on the lines of, do you consider the effect of solar plus storage on an ELCC perspective? And this chart shows a classic example of yes, we do. So when you look at the ELCC value of solar, and then you look at the ELCC value of storage, they actually have a complementary effect on one another. In other words, as you add storage and solar together, they have increased benefits because you see the solar is pushing that net peak into the early hours of the evening. So as you add more storage to the system, you are able to then discharge your storage from 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m. So they have a complementary effect on one another. And we do take that into consideration as we calculate ELCC values.
Okay, so Ben, that's then another factor that is part of the modeling analysis and would not be expected to be seen on something like your slide 24, which showed effective capacities of solar and battery, because those are inputs, and then the synergistic ELCC is an output or result of the modeling, right?
Yes, that's correct.
I'll just add there, Cynthia, that, we also have other ways of presenting, the solar plus storage surface. And what we were showing is kind of the separate effects. But, the dimensionality of the surface isn't very easy to follow. But there are tables that we'll probably include at a later date just to show kind of those interactive effects.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, Margie, apologies for taking us off the presentation, but I thought it might be easier to show some visuals in those responses. So happy to take any further questions on ELCCs right now. If not, we can go back to the presentation at hand.
Great, thank you, Ben. No, very good. Any other questions at this point about ELCCs? All right, let's go to folks with your hands raised. Let's start with you, Steve Fishman. Please go ahead with your question.
Whoop. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. This is about the ELCC. So, and it has to do with 4-hour batteries versus 8-hour batteries. And it seems to me that even without 8-hour battery technology, you could say, for instance, double the amount of 4-hour storage you deploy, and simply manage when it's dispatched to create 8 hours. And so that's it makes me wonder how much the battery management impacts the ELCC. And so can someone kind of describe that to me? And then, as the question I'm asking, making any sense?
Steve, this is Ben again. The question you're asking makes complete and utter sense. Essentially, you're talking about daisy chaining 2 4-hour batteries together to create an 8-hour battery. The reason you would just not do that is simply economics, where if you were to install an 8-hour battery, it should just be cheaper than installing twice as many 4-hour batteries.
Okay. And is that something that, as you manage your 4-hour batteries, that you do some daisy chaining already in order to get the best ELCC impact?
Not so much from an ELCC perspective, but more from an energy arbitrage perspective, you would. In other words,
Okay.
the battery should be charged and discharged that result in the lowest cost. Now, that doesn't mean all 4-hour storage resources would be charged and discharged at the same time.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I see Phil Simpson, and I understand, Don Kurtz, you may have your virtual hand up. You'll be next, Don. So let's start with Phil. Go ahead with your question, please.
Yeah, can we go back to slide 15? On that slide, there was the impact of electric vehicles on load was depicted. And I guess my question is, what about building electrification? Is that considered at all? And just to let you know where I'm coming from, this is related to my review of the market potential survey and the fact that it essentially assumed no switching from gas to electric heating in homes. So yeah, first question is there any impact of building electrification in this load forecast?
Emmanuel, oh, there you are.
Yeah. If you give us a couple minutes, Phil, I'll track down that answer for you. I want to make sure that I don't give you any incorrect information.
Okay, thank you. We can come back to it.
Okay.
Nate?
This is Senarina with Web Research. I can answer that for you. No, we do not consider any effects of switching over to electrification for homes in part of the load forecast.
Okay. I guess I would argue that's not a very good assumption that we need to really consider that, because I think that's part of what needs to happen for the energy transition is switching from gas heating to heat pumps.
Can I
So
just
I guess I'd
maybe
go ahead.
Sorry, Mr. Simpson, if I could just maybe jump in here. Just a quick reminder to everyone on the call. What we're showing here on slide 15 is our base load forecast assumptions. As we presented in Las Cruces, we will be evaluating two other load growth scenarios, one that incorporates additional large load customers and another that incorporates additional electrification. So I think we will capture, the potential for electrification of home heating, maybe greater penetration of EVs, etc., within that third load growth scenario.
Okay, thank you.
If I can there, Phil, one thing, and this is George Novella. I know in New Mexico, we're seeing some developments and some legislation or at the local level on all electric subdivisions. We're not seeing that still in mass. And, essentially on our service territory, it's 80% gas heat, and the economics are where gas heat's still the preferred, way to heat our homes in this part of the region. It's something that we do look at and think about quite often. I think it's not at the point yet where we want to make that an input into the model, but it is something that we do think about and analyze. So just to put that out there.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome, Phil.
Margie, if I might interject, we have a follow-up question from the question about 4-hour versus 8-hour batteries and daisy chain, just to sort of tie that thread. And I see several of you, we're tracking you in the chat, and we will come to you. Thank you for your patience.
Kathy, I just want to point out, these are all great questions, everybody, but a lot of this is going to be addressed later on in the presentation as we start to hit on everybody's requests for modeling. So we can keep that in mind. All of this is going to come back around.
Yeah, thanks, Emmanuel. This is Nate again. I think maybe as Ben pointed out, like this load forecast is our base scenario forecast, and we're just right now talking about our base case. So kind of you could assume it's kind of a business as usual, kind of the now kind of extends into the future case of assumptions, and that includes the resources, which are all kind of mature technologies. We're not yet discussing the alternative scenarios, which I know that everybody helped us brainstorm on. Ben's going to touch on that and kind of how we bring these other resources and load option forecasts into exploring some scenarios. So yeah, I know that there's a lot of technologies we're interested in as well. I'm seeing those questions. So I just want to flag that. I will say that why not modeling 10 or 12-hour batteries? Because they could be even cheaper. And I'm guessing, Glenn, you're referring to, cheaper than 8-hour. However, what that means is, the 8-hour, on an effective capacity basis, if you didn't have the 8-hour switch over there, you would just have to build 4 hours until, it became cheaper to build the 10 or 12-hour, but it may be predominantly more expensive in the near term. So you might have to build more 4 hours to get there. So just flagging that, typically what we do is we saturate one 8, like the 8-hour, and then we move to 10 or 4 hour, and then we move to 8 or 10 hours storage. And then, for very kind of ambitious cases, we'll explore higher or larger duration batteries. But daisy chaining these together, typically you start with what's most cost effective first, which is the 4-hour, and then you move to an 8-hour, then a 10 or 12-hour. But modeling all of these may not be necessary. What we understand in the model forecast it from the battery modeling is that at some point we need to switch over to a longer duration, and that will be a more cost effective resource to support the capacity needs on EP system. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that, Nate. So I apologize. This is my failing here to not be clearer about these are all base case assumptions, what we're building the basis of our model off of. And then we'll get into more detail as to what the different requests are. So, but thank you everyone for your questions.
Great, thanks for that clarification. I've got Don, Kurtz, Ryan, Steve, and Cynthia in the hands up queue. So Don, please go ahead.
Hi, while I was trying to figure out how to raise my hand, Steve asked the question that I had. So just by telepathy, I was able to share that with him.
Okay, great. Thanks, Don, for your patience with technology. Ryan, please go ahead, Ryan Brown.
Hi. So I think I have a couple questions, but it was slide 30 was, oh, sorry, 30. Maybe it's 29. Anyway, I guess my question is that in previous IRPs, the peak hour of the day, namely like late afternoon, when solar shutting down and batteries are turning on, was kind of the focus of the modeling. Whereas now I understand the industry and we've moved on to ELCC. But sort of the issue is that I don't know, maybe you are looking at capacity factors or looking at peak hours as well. But I guess just simply my question is, how are risk hours defined? Because previously it was difficult to fulfill that sort of late afternoon peak, and the solution was batteries. But if I remember correctly, in I think our first meeting, it showed the peak hour for 2024. And it showed capacity factors for solar, I believe, on the order of like 90%. And the Newman 6 natural gas plant was offline. So I guess just a simple question is, how are risk hours defined? And then second, is there also, are we also taking in consideration capacity factors and I guess sort of these peak hours that were the focus of modeling previously, even though now the industry and E3 in this modeling has moved on to ELCC?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Ben, I don't know if you have that same deck open. It might help us just in defining the risk hours. If not, I can go back to one of our previous stakeholder meeting presentations where we talked about the shift from just planning for peak to where we're planning now.
Michelle, were you able to open up the...
Sorry, I'm muted. I guess my question is not necessarily, I understand the reasoning behind moving to ELCC, but are sort of, is peak and capacity factor and ELC, are all three considered as opposed to just one or the other? Because El Paso is sort of a unique territory in that there is a high peak demand for AC in the late afternoon in the summer, but also solar matches very well with that peak. So
Yeah, so I think,
kind of both work.
yeah, this is a good question, Ryan. So
Yeah.
all are being taken into account, right? So what we're talking through is just kind of like trying to characterize kind of what the inputs and assumptions are. And there are multiple facets, to each resource type or, consideration. And we're just kind of walking through, the cost, the ELCC. But the capacity factor is not taken into account in the fact that we're not just putting these into a spreadsheet, right, and trading them off to determine which one is, the better resources being added. It's, as we talked about before, an optimization model, right? So the capacity factor will be taken into account when the model is considering to add more resources and the cost effectiveness of that resource. But the ELCC will also be taken into account to see the cost effectiveness of the resource to contribute to the PRM. So all of them will be taken into account, by the economic kind of capacity expansion model, if that's what the question is. I will also just flag that, the problematic hours or the hours of highest risk are, consistently changing, right? So when EPE did their IRP a number of years ago, they had a different portfolio on the system, right? And their load profile was a little bit different. And that portfolio on the system, kind of similar to what Ben is showing here, as we add more solar, that peak or that net peak hour or set of hours gets shifted, right? And as we add solar and storage, it gets shifted and flattened. So that's kind of how we're defining kind of the net load and the peak now, not as just when is the total peak of load, but when is the peak in the net load, and when we have problematic hours of loss of load potential on the system. And this is identical to what was done in the last IRP as for determining the PRM and the ELCCs of solar storage and wind. However, as EPE has added more solar onto the system, that solar is taking a big chunk out of the load and the peak load during the hours that solar is available, right? But that shifts the peak and the need or those risk hours to later in the evening, meaning that the ELCC of solar is no longer as high as it was probably in the previous IRP. And then same with storage, as we're adding storage on, as Ben noted, it's flattening this peak, so it's also impacting where those risk hours are. So those risk hours are being moved, and they're different than what they were in the previous IRP, and that's why you see different ELCCs here.
Mm-hmm. I guess it's more so that just maybe a 19% ELCC, it seems a bit low, and it seemed that the sort of, I think it was slide 29, I'm not sure, 28, but it just seemed that risk hours was being defined as nighttime, whereas Palo Verde is going to eat up the large majority of the nighttime demand.
Yeah,
I mean,
and so capacity factor
risk hours are AC afternoon, summer, as opposed to, so solar fits that very well.
I think I'll flag first, Ryan, that capacity factor doesn't automatically correlate to the ELCC, right? Something might have a really great capacity factor, but if it doesn't align with the loss of load probability or those risk hours, then the ELCC is not going to be high. So you could still have, a higher capacity factor for a resource, but if it didn't align with those those risk hours, the ELCC is going to drop. But where those risk hours are being shifted, right? And this is not EPE's system here, but typically, yeah, in the summer months, it might be later evening when air conditioning is turning on or shifting, or turning on and shifting up when people are coming home from work. But as we have more solar penetration, it's going to shift those even later into the evening because solar will take the first bite out of that peak, if that makes sense, Ryan.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's just, I guess. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess that works. It just seems. Okay. I mean, I understand that it seems that to me that solar is undervalued with using ELC solely, but maybe it's just, maybe I'll find the slide, but I was surprised in the first meeting that we had. It showed the peak hour of 2024, and solar was matching up at a high capacity, or just a high, I guess, capacity factor.
And was that the net peak, Ryan, or is that the actual peak?
I need to probably pull up the slide, but I was just surprised that there seems to be this focus on ELCC when really that the peak hours, those difficult to match hours, are like.
Hey Ryan, I'm going to
Whereas
suggest.
I guess ELCC is looking at the whole day, 24 hours, as opposed to maybe there's like 3 or 4 peak hours per day every day of the summer, where the capacity of solar is matching very well.
So let me suggest that we take this offline at this point, Ryan. I think maybe hopefully we can work with E3 and EPE to answer your question more fully. Let me get to a couple other questions here before we run out of time on this. But thanks.
No problem.
Okay.
Yep.
I think we've got Steve, Cynthia, and Dawn in the queue. Steve, please go ahead.
Okay. You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. HB 93 was passed in this last legislative session, which specifically allows a data center to, if they build their own power plants, to be exempt from the renewable portfolio standard in the state. In other words, they could decide to build gas and it will not be part of the calculation of the statewide renewable portfolio standard. Honestly, I hate that provision. I think it just says rich folks can buy out of their responsibility to help on climate. But my specific question is, how does that impact your forecasting on large load customers in the future?
I can answer that if you want, Emmanuel. Is that all right?
Yeah, yes, please.
Sure. So Steve, a couple of things there. So we've gotten over 8 gigawatts of interest at El Paso Electric, and over 5 gigawatts of continuous back and forth with data centers. Now, out of all of that, we're only including right now about 10% in our load forecast, so about 500 megawatts. And I feel pretty comfortable that those 500 megawatts aren't going to be part of what you just described with regards to bringing their own generation. Now, as we were, to move forward in time and further discussions with other entities, there may be some entities that look into what you just described. But with what we have now in the forecast, I don't understand. I haven't heard that any of them are looking at or analyzing anything to do with bringing in their own gas generation.
Okay. And then one follow-up question, well, a couple of quick follow-up questions. In terms of the 500 megawatts, you're talking about over the next 3 or 4 years? What time period does that apply to?
That's right. Yeah, it'd probably be about before 2030 it would hit.
Okay. Does it make sense there's a lot of risks in my mind, and I was just at a PRC meeting where the commissioners were discussing the risks of if things go sideways with one of these huge customers, everyone else can get stuck with some very big costs. And how do you protect from that? And it seems to me there might be some wisdom, at least worth considering, that EPE set some limits about how much large load capacity they add in any given time period in order to, as an additional protection to what was discussed at that meeting. There were all kinds of contract provisions and that kind of stuff. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So Steve, let me interject that I don't think this is a question related to the base case modeling assumptions, the deals and conditions that get put in place for large customers to reduce risk to all. Can we hold this? It really is a conversation, I think, about a possible action plan, or you don't agree?
Well, so the question isn't about specifics of contracts. It's just,
What's the question?
is that something, is it worth considering setting a limit and saying, we'll consider all these contracts, but for forecasting purposes and for system reliability, would it make sense to say in any given year, we shouldn't be adding any more than 300 megawatts of large customer capacity? And is that something that's an issue that should be considered?
Yeah, I could quickly answer that. And one point earlier, I said those 500 megawatts. One thing to keep in mind, the majority of that is in Texas. But to answer your question, I don't think there should be a cap, because I think we're gonna frame or structure them in a way, and we are currently, where we have strong protections with regards to long-term commitments from collateral, things like that. And the more we get of data centers on our system, the more we prove our system load factor and can have positive impacts to our other customers. So I wouldn't want to cap us from those positive potentials.
I'm not sure I agree with that assumption that it automatically creates benefits for other customers, but we'll discuss that offline.
Okay, all right. Thanks. And also, Steve, if you look at what's included in the two load scenarios in addition to the base, that might be the place for a discussion about that. And there is some of that component in the stakeholder request modeling runs, the increased demand from.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, I've got Cynthia, then Don, then Phil, and then we are going to be out of time on this topic. So if there are three others than Cynthia, Don, and Phil that have a question, please put it into the chat and we will document it and find a way to get back to you. But Cynthia, please go ahead first.
I do have a series of questions, and I'm going to go ahead and just write those up and send that as a file to you, and I'll copy out of the chat some of the questions I already have there. But I do want to follow up on this matter of the large loads, the IT data centers. And so if I look at the load forecast now, you've got 541 megawatts. You peak out in 2029. And what I understand, George, you basically said or commented to Steve, is that we really shouldn't take that as a cap, that it's very possible that you will look at continuing to add these IT data center loads. And then just as a point of reference, and I'd like to be able to discuss it with the company later, is that we don't necessarily see raising the overall base of 24/7 loads as a beneficial way of improving your system load factor. And then the rest of my questions, like I said, I will put in writing and make sure you get a file that can go to EPE on that, okay?
I don't think I agree with that last comment, and you might have misstated it, that I don't think that 24/7 loads would help our base. I think they would help.
No, I thought you said that it would improve your load factor.
Oh, okay. I thought you said wouldn't. Yeah.
Well, let me say this. It does improve your load factor. And then is that the most beneficial way, or is that a good way of improving load factor? And
it is.
I'd like to have the conversation that you're still then chasing an out of control peak.
I wouldn't agree with that, but it would improve our overall load factor. You're substantially increasing energy at a higher rate than you would demand, and overall that would just improve your overall system load factor and better utilization of your system. So I think there's a lot of benefits along with that.
Well, but you're still chasing an out of control peak, and you're going to have to still continue to add resources for that. So let's talk about that another time.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Cynthia. And if you have the additional questions you have, it's very helpful if you do put them into the chat. I realize you might have to run them past your team, and so that's the reason for a separate file, but we'd like to incorporate them in this document if we can from this meeting. So if possible, we'll take what you've got there. Anything addition would be great. It's helpful for us if you could put them in this format. Thank you.
Okay, they'll come in a separate file. That works better for us. Thank you, Margie.
We have Dawn, and Dawn, I don't see your hands still up, or do
Yeah,
Dawn?
I don't know, maybe I took it down accidentally, but I do have a question. Just in general, as we look towards acquiring these resources, how does the Energy Transition Act affect resource acquisition decisions, if at all, as we're going along here, especially as we have these 2035 and 2045 goals of getting zero carbon energy? So I just wondered how it's being taken into account.
I can jump in and take that one, Don. So we're doing several scenarios here. If you recall from the stakeholder meeting in Las Cruces, we're going to do one scenario that is essentially excludes any state requirements. So it's just least cost. And that would exclude the Energy Transition Act in its entirety going forward. That's just a baseline to help inform Texas. From there, we do another scenario where for the New Mexico load share, we enforce the Energy Transition Act. So we have to meet the renewable portfolio standards in each year. Under that scenario, we run two different cases. The first does not allow any new gas generation, which essentially aligns with the 2045 carbon-free requirement. The second sensitivity underneath the ETA scenario would allow gas generation today on the assumption by 2045 it needs to be carbon-free. That would either be, hydrogen fuel, or it would be carbon capture. So we've got basically a range of scenarios that evaluate the cost of the ETA and then different solutions to meet in the Energy Transition Act.
Okay, great. Thanks for coming back to that. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Great. Thanks. Phil, you have the last question for this particular segment.
Yeah, I know we're supposed to be talking about baseload here, so I guess my question is, the market potential survey that we've talked about before, and you distributed a link before the last meeting, was that used as part of calculating the base load for El Paso Electric? I mean, I guess because if it was, I think we need to talk more about it, because from my point of view, I think there's some severe deficiencies in that study.
George, is that one that you want to take on?
I'm sorry, Phil, I didn't catch that.
Go ahead. If Anna Dina is on, she might be able to answer that. I think Phil's question is, what amount of demand side management it was included in the base assumption? Was it what came out of the potential study or something else? Is that your question, Phil?
Yeah, essentially there was demand management and energy efficiency and some other aspects of that market potential survey that when I read it, I had some what I think are deficiencies that I'd like to talk about offline. I think if that study was used at all, because to me it ignored military aspects of it. There's only less than 0.03% of load management, which seems pretty small. And then there's the heat pump issues and the way social cost of carbon and UCT were not considered together.
Yeah. Would you like to answer that, Adina, or myself?
I can answer part of it. Energy, as far as energy efficiency, it was modeled after the goals that are in effect for New Mexico. So it's just whatever goals we need to meet. That's what our assumption is for New Mexico energy efficiency going forward. As far as the demand response, we do not include that as part of our load forecast because it is treated as a supply resource. So it's not a reduction to our load forecast.
Okay, so are you saying that market potential survey, I shouldn't worry about it? I shouldn't worry about the deficiencies in it because you didn't use it?
For energy efficiency, we did not use it. That's correct.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Great. Thank you all for the questions and the responses. Let's shift gears for 30 minutes and hear back from EPE and E3 on how they've processed the thoughtful model-related requests that the stakeholders have turned in. So back over to you, your team, to continue your presentation. And we will again hold questions until the Q&A session, which will be after our short break. So back to you. Maybe that's Ben or Nate or Manuel. Not sure who's going to start.
Yeah, this would be me, Margie. Thank you. And Margie, just a quick time check here. Are we on schedule? Do I still have 30 minutes for this piece?
Yes, sir.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so maybe we'll just start here a little bit more generically or high level, and just in terms of just generally speaking, how utilities look at scenario planning. So here in this slide, we typically have a funneled approach on the right-hand side here. And the first step in the process is really just brainstorming. So we want to encourage members of the utility initially to throw out as many kind of potential ideas for scenarios and sensitivity analyses as possible. And obviously, specific to EPE in New Mexico, this brainstorming session obviously included you, as the stakeholders within this process. So initially, we asked you guys to submit those stakeholder request forms on just whatever you wanted to see as part of this IRP analysis. Once we've got through the brainstorming phase, then we need to start refining the scenarios. And I'm going to go into more detail about this in a moment. But essentially, what we're looking to do is either to group certain themes of requests together, prioritize certain scenarios, and then obviously exclude any scenarios that maybe do not meet the criteria of the IRP or the ISP. And then from there, we select a manageable number of scenarios to move forward to production cost and capacity expansion modeling. So let's go to the next slide. In here, I just really want to maybe make a point. When we look at doing scenario and sensitivity analyses, what we're really looking at doing is evaluating high impact, high uncertainty items. So if we look at the scenarios that we have designed for EP, the EP driven scenarios, we're talking about things such as the load forecast. We're talking about the availability of certain technologies. Do we allow gas? Do we exclude gas? And then we start looking at what does the future hold for resources? Does it mean long duration storage? Does it mean nuclear? Does it mean hydrogen fired CTs? So really those big ticket items. Now, the reason we concentrate on these high impact, high uncertainty type items is because they really drive differences in statement of need. So as we start discussing stakeholder requests today, we did try and group your scenarios together. We received 11 requests for demand side solution scenarios. Now, demand side solution is a high impact event, but the differences between each of the scenarios could be materially kind of non-impactful from one scenario to the next. So we tried to group them together to make sure we're considering demand side solutions. And if we go to the next slide, just want to kind of show you, this is not EPE system, this is illustrative only, but this really shows you kind of like the results of the modeling. So if we concentrate on this graph here, we have 6 different timeframes. So this is someone else's IRP. You see 2027 here, all the way through to 2050. As you go out further into the future, the results of the modeling, so the statement of need, has a wider range of results under each of the scenarios. So if you look at these bar charts, in 2050, for example, if we look at wind, so on this extreme right, you'll see this bar chart which shows the difference between the minimum amount of wind being built and the upper level of wind being built on that blue bar chart there. And then that white circle represents kind of the average amount of wind being built in this scenario. And as you can see, out into the future, there's a wide range of different resources being built under different assumptions. But as you come closer in time, so you start looking at 27 to 2030, and you're really looking at the action period coming out from IRP, the difference, the delta between scenarios is much, much smaller. So really what we're looking for is kind of common investment decisions that are coming out of this IRP. So for example, if we get through all of these different modeling scenarios and within the statement of need, every single scenario says EP should be building at least 100 megawatts of wind, just as an example, that would be a pretty safe assumption that that should be an action that the utility starts looking into. So that's just kind of how we try and group the results to try and get like for like answers coming out of what could be a very wide range of different scenarios and sensitivities. So now let's get on to EP specific data here. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, so as Margie mentioned at the top of this call, we received 26 different stakeholder request forms. Of the 2026 stakeholder request forms, actually 2 requests in total. Now, I do want to just be really clear here. Some of these stakeholder request forms actually included multiple different requests. So in terms of the number of requests or the number of scenarios that EP were asked to model, it was slightly higher or pretty significantly higher than 24. And I am just going to pause. I am getting a notice on my screen saying I have poor bandwidth at the moment. So Margie, just confirming, still coming through okay?
Yes, yes, you're still coming through. There was a little break, but you're still coming through.
Okay, thank you. If we go to the next slide. So of the 24 stakeholder requests that were received, there were 6 that we determined to be non-conforming stakeholder requests. And what does that mean? Well, I break them out into 2 different buckets here. First, we received 3 stakeholder requests that weren't really stakeholder requests at all. And I'm going to talk about them in more detail later. And we also received 3 stakeholder requests that just exceeded the limitations of the 2025 ISP. And again, I'm going to discuss those in the next slide. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, so let's start with the requests that just exceeded the limitations of the ISP. So first, Mr. Downs asked us to model battery energy storage on certain points of the distribution system. Just as a reminder, we will be modeling the transmission system, zonally representation of the transmission system, as Nate demonstrated earlier, but we are not modeling the distribution system in this IRP ISP. So unfortunately, it's not possible to model batteries on specific locations on the distribution system. I will just say in response to Alan's request that many other of the items that he raised within that request, we will be capturing within all of our modeling scenarios. So for example, Mr. Downs made some suggestions on how we should model battery energy storage from an energy arbitrage perspective in terms of when it should be charged, when it should be discharged. All of his requests that were stated in the, his stakeholder request will be captured in the modeling except the locational specific component. And then we also received a request from the Department of Defense to do some modeling that was very specific to their actual system, so the customer's system. And again, unfortunately, that was just a little too detailed for us to incorporate into this IRP, ISP type analyses. And then finally, we received a request from the Army to do some more system resiliency type analyses. So this would be reliability resiliency analyses above and beyond traditional planning approaches. So this would incorporate potential issues such as cybersecurity, physical disruptions into transmission or substations. While resiliency is extremely important, Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get into that level of detail in the time frame that we have, but we'll just maybe point you to other initiatives that EPE would be working on from system resiliency. And if we go to the next slide, just want to talk about maybe kind of the 3 requests that didn't really require any modeling. So Mr. Rankin requested that we provided emissions data from the modeling results. So again, this isn't necessarily a modeling request. What this is, it's a request for outputs from the modeling. And I'm just happy to say we can provide emissions data for all of the scenarios, all of the sensitivities that we evaluate. So we can absolutely meet this requirement, just not as a modeling scenario in itself. And then also, Mr. Brown provided critiques on both assumptions for hydrogen and also carbon capture. Again, these weren't necessarily like modeling inputs per se, they were more just concerns about modeling approaches. And as we present those scenarios in the 5th and the 6th meeting, we'll make sure to address some of the questions or the concerns raised by Mr. Brown. If we go to the next slide. So if we take the 24 conforming scenarios, or excuse me, the total scenarios, we remove the 6 non-conforming scenarios, we end up with 18 different stakeholder requests. And those 18 requests fell into 5 distinct categories. So if we go to the next slide, as we look at this pie chart here to the left, you'll see the majority of the 18 requests were all related to demand side solutions. Demand side solutions being things like time of use rates, demand response, behind the meter generation. So obviously strong interest in seeing scenarios that address those topics. And I will get into that in a moment. There were also scenarios that wanted to look up potential load growth and electrification scenarios. I think Mr. Simpson has represented some of those requests throughout this conversation. I will talk a little bit more about EP's plans for load growth scenarios. I would also just flag that there are some overlap between load growth scenarios and demand side options. So if you may disagree slightly with our categorization here, but broadly speaking, they were the 2 kind of big requests. In addition, we received a couple of requests based on modeling of the transmission system, another request based on a social cost of carbon, and then also some critiques, kind of feedback on supply side resources that I would also address. So if we go to the next slide, I want to talk first about the 2 requests that we received looking into load growth and electrification. And before I do, I just want to note this graph on the right-hand side here shows 2 of EPE's 3 load forecasts that we will be modeling as part of this ISP. So the blue forecast on the bottom here, this aligns with the loads and resources table that Emmanuel presented at the beginning of this meeting. So this is the base load forecast that only includes the most certain or the most confident large load customers. And then what we see here in this dark orange band is that same load forecast, the blue load forecast, plus some more large load customers that maybe aren't quite as far along as the process. So this kind of gives us a lower and an upper bounds that we can kind of benchmark to. So one of the first requests that we received that we're not planning on doing additional modeling for was to study incremental large load requests of 80 megawatts, 150 megawatts, or 250 megawatts. Because that request, I should say, falls within the bounds of these 2 scenarios, I think the modeling that we're already going to do is going to be able to answer that question. So we're going to be able to see, as you add additional large loads to the IRP, what additional types of resources are needed to meet that requirement. And then the second request from Mr. Simpson was to evaluate some of the electrification goals from the city of Las Cruces. Now, I think this aligns with the 3rd load forecast scenario that EPE are planning to run that is not available yet, hence why it's not shown on this chart, which would include electrification push, not just in Las Cruces, but as a wider push across the industry. So again, I think that's going to be captured in the additional scenario that we're looking at. If we go to the next slide, here was really where we received most of the requests. So as I mentioned earlier, there were 11 inquiries regarding demand side scenario solutions. And really there was kind of some questions stakeholders were raising here. One is, could you offset the need for new peaking generation, i.e. new gas plants or new battery energy storage, by expanding the demand response initiatives that are currently available? What impact would flattening the load curve have on total system costs? So in other words, if you implemented measures such as time of use rates and you push load from the peak to the early evening, could that create a higher load factor system, which in turn lowers customer costs? And then the kind of the third component of these demand side scenarios was behind the meter alternatives. So could you do rooftop solar? Could you do residential battery energy storage as examples to reduce the need for large scale centralized power sources? So what we're going to be proposing is 2 scenarios that address these questions. The first will be tailored towards commercial industrial customers. So we will look as we increase C&I load, particularly with data centers and large load customers. What is the impact if we assume some of that new customer base and some existing customers could be put on increased demand response programs? Can that lower the need for new generation and in turn lower cost to customers? And then in addition to the C&I scenario, we will also do a residential solution. And in the residential solution, we're going to be looking at a combination of all of the above. Now, some people call that DER, some people call that virtual power plants. But just to be really clear, what we will be looking at here is a combined project that incorporates behind the meter generation, rooftop solar, residential storage. It would incorporate things like time of use rates and also demand response on the residential side. So we're going to kind of try and combine those 11 requests into these 2 scenarios. Now, the parameters of these 2 scenarios are not yet defined. In the next week or 2 weeks, we will be reaching out to the DER team again, and we will come towards that DER team with our proposed parameters for these modeling scenarios. And we will absolutely be looking for your feedback and your approval on the 2 scenarios that we are presenting.
So
if we go to the next.
Ben, let me just jump in for a moment to give a little more specificity on what we've decided to do with this. Just to be clear, we're going to invite any stakeholder who has an interest in those parameters to attend an office hour on May the 6th, late in the afternoon, to define these parameters of these 2 scenarios that Ben just described. So 2 clarifications. We won't limit it to people who've just been involved in the DER conversations. We'll invite any stakeholder who wishes to participate, and GridWorks will facilitate that on May the 6th. You'll see that as part of the summary from this meeting. The specifics of that session have been set up for the afternoon of May the 6th. Sorry, Ben, to interrupt.
No, I appreciate you keeping me honest. Thank you, Margie. Next slide. So now if we look here at the 6 scenarios that we are proposing to model. First, we have the C&I demand response program that I just mentioned. Second, we have the residential demand side solution scenario, the combination of demand response, behind the meter resources, etc. In addition to those demand response scenarios, we're proposing 2 other scenarios that were directly requested by stakeholders. So Mr. Fishman requested that we evaluate a scenario that incorporates the social cost of carbon. So for our modeling, we will do 1 scenario where we incorporate a carbon tax essentially to new resource selections. And then in addition, we will model a scenario, and this is based on Mr. Brown's request, so kudos to him here, where we will evaluate increased market interaction with the neighboring RTO, in this case, the Southwest Power Pool. So we will do a scenario where we say, okay, we're going to assume the HVDC tie that connects EP system to the Texas Panhandle. We're going to do some improvements there so that becomes increased, more reliable, and then we'll model a scenario where we have more opportunity to buy and sell from the Southwest Power Pool. And then we have two other scenarios that we're proposing to do as post-processing analyses. So rather than do these as modeling inputs, we're actually going to evaluate the results of the model. The first one was Mr. Kurtz, I believe, requested a scenario where we look at grid enhancing technologies. Our suggestion here is rather than to try and model this as a modeling input, because it becomes extremely challenging to create all of these different potential inputs and assumptions, is we essentially look at the results of each scenario and sensitivity, and we look for points where the transmission system becomes congested or becomes a bottleneck. And where we find scenarios where the transmission system becomes problematic, the current default setting within Plexos right now is to build new transmission. It has the option of building new transmission lines to increase flow. What we'll look at is, rather than building new transmission, could we do things like grid enhancing technology, such as dynamic line ratings, to improve transmission flow capability at a lower cost? And then the other scenario that we're going to look at post-analyses was to Mr. Simpson's request, which was to kind of evaluate how EPE could incorporate new large load customers, assuming they were flexible, so assuming they were willing to be interrupted. Our approach here would be, again, to look at each of the scenarios and sensitivities and evaluate how much headroom is left on the system. Once we can see how much headroom from the generation fleet is left on the system, we'll be able to calculate how much additional load could be connected, making assumptions on how frequently that load could be interrupted. So if we go to the next slide, I also want to be just very clear here, in addition to the 6 scenarios that we are proposing to model, we also are incorporating many other of the feedback that we've received from stakeholders here. So Mr. Brown, for example, wanted to see whether wind and storage could offset new gas peaking generation. Again, just to confirm, every scenario that we look at, that will include wind storage as candidate resources. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Downs made recommendations on how we should operate storage. All of his requests, except for cited on the distribution system, will be incorporated into all of our modeling inputs and assumptions. And likewise, as I mentioned earlier, we'll go back to Mr. Brown and make sure we respond to his critiques on hydrogen and carbon capture. Again, as I mentioned earlier, to Mr. Rankin's point, we will provide all of the emissions data for each scenario. And we also received a request from Form Energy to model 100-hour long duration storage. Again, just to clarify, per our meeting in Las Cruces, we are already going to model a scenario which includes long duration storage. What we'll do here is, rather than do an additional scenario, is we'll just make sure our high level assumptions align with the expectation for 100-hour storage. So if we go to the next slide, just confirming next steps here. As Margie just mentioned, on May the 6th, I believe, we will be hosting another office hour to define the parameters of the demand side modeling scenarios, the 2 I described. We will confirm with Mr. Fishman and others who are interested our assumptions for the social cost of carbon. We will also confirm with Mr. Brown and others who are interested our assumptions for the increased market capability study. And then slightly further ahead, as we complete the modeling or the initial modeling, we will make sure we do post-processing analyses with regards to flexible loads and then also grid enhancing technologies. So I think that was my final slide. I will pause there, and Margie, happy to answer questions we have now or after a short break.
Thank you, Ben, Nate, and the team for putting this together and presenting it so clearly. I would like us to go ahead and take our 10-minute break now. I show my time says 2:49, so at well, let's say it's 2:50 at 3 o'clock. Let's reconvene and give anybody a chance to ask questions about this approach for dealing with the stakeholder model related requests. So let's go on break for 10 minutes and resume at 3 o'clock. Thank you. Welcome back. Deborah, are we recording again?
Yes, we are.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that discussion. Our plan for this next portion of the meeting for the next 45 minutes is to really talk about the approach for handling the model requests that came in from stakeholders. And so there are two things we'd like for you to think about. One is if you have a topic that you really want to talk about related to how these model run requests are going to be handled, we'd like you to put that topic in the chat. And my colleague Kathy will monitor the chat and look for themes that most people are interested in and help create space for that conversation. Please think about what questions or clarification you need. We will be asking at the end of this 45-minute segment for you to respond to a quick poll on how comfortable you are, how much in agreement you are with the plan that's been presented for handling these requests. So that is the focus of our conversation for the next 45 minutes. If there's places where you don't agree with the approach, please point those out to us. So I'm going to ask Ben to give a few remarks as he's getting ready to do that. And you're putting your topics that you want to talk about into the chat. Let me just quickly share my screen. Deb, I'm going to stop share my screen to remind everyone about the presentation during workshop number 3 that included, can you see my slide? No. Let me try again. Yeah, here is the EPE modeling hierarchy. Can you actually see the model hierarchy here, Ben?
Yes, I
Margie,
can.
maybe if you close the all tasks on the left side, make the slide a little bigger.
All tools?
All tools. Sorry, see the X? Yeah, right there.
Yeah, yeah.
Got it. There you go.
Okay. This this is to support the conversation, to remind people what is already going to be modeled for the New Mexico part of the system. And the scenarios that Ben described, the approach is in addition to these scenarios here. So just wanted to remind you of that. That's slide 43 from workshop 3 in case you wanted to refer to that. But Ben, let me turn it over to you. And then Michelle, you may want to pull up slide 44 from today's presentation, or 45 from today's presentation to support the conversation. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, thank you, Margie. Margie, just during the break, I was just thinking about the conversation that George was having with Cynthia and Steve on the potential of, do you restrict large loads? Is it in the benefit of residential customers to, or is it too risky? And I maybe just want to go back just a step and say, like, trying to look at what the question we're trying to answer as part of this IRP, ISP actually is, right? So we're not trying to find the correct result in terms of what scenario should we model. What we're trying to do is we're trying to model a range of different potential futures. And then from there, we look at the modeling results and we can start asking questions like, is this feasible? How much is this going to cost? What are the potential risks, right? And then from there, EPE issue requests for proposals and they try and firm up the assumptions for actual resources that are out in the market. And then from there, they go into other regulatory proceedings like CCNs and rate cases for, judgments on prudency. So I just want everyone to kind of just keep in mind right now is the IRP is not trying to find the one true truth in this matter, right? We're trying to identify different potential futures. What is the solution and what is the cost under those different solutions? So as we're looking at this IRP process, please don't expect, hey, just because my scenario wasn't modeled exactly as I wanted it, that gets forgotten about, right? What we're trying to do is just see what are the types, what are the technologies that EP are going to need over the next 5 to 10 years and beyond. So I just want to maybe bring us up just a slight level there.
Great. Thank you. So the floor is really now open. I see is open to questions and comments about the disposition of stakeholder model related requests that Ben has walked through. I think a good summary of that is on slide 45 from today. Yeah, well, this one, 44 and 45, the next one might be helpful as well. So this is what Ben described for the path going forward. We already mentioned that on May the 6th at 3:45, and we'll get that detail out to you. We plan to host a meeting of stakeholders interested in defining the parameters of these very two distinct demand response scenarios, one intended to address the residential customer perspective and one for commercial and industrial users. So we'll invite people to participate in that to help inform those parameters. But what questions, looks like Phil, you have a question. Kathy, is there anything else in the chat yet? Okay. Phil, do you want to pose your question about DR versus utility solar on slide 44 here?
Sure. Yeah, for behind the meter alternatives, that bullet, I guess my question is how that will be modeled, because I could see that if you just compared the costs of residential solar and battery storage versus utility battery and storage, residential is going to be much more expensive just because of economies of scale. But if you model it in terms of, okay, what if we gave an incentive to the customers to install residential solar and battery? I think that's a much different it's a much different scenario, and with much lower cost, because their costs, much of the cost is going to be borne by consumers who were just interested in helping out and being green. So yeah, that's my question, is how will that be modeled?
So, Phil, I would take the first stab at that, and I absolutely don't want to ignore your question, but I do want to just say that that is the sole purpose of the next meeting on May 6th, is to really to get into the parameters of how we're going to model this.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm happy to wait until then if that's appropriate.
Kyle, you have a question. Please go ahead.
I'm just trying to get clarification on the response saying that the DoD FEA and I guess Army was treated as something different than DoD FEA, but I want to make clear that we're not different. We're all part of DoD FEA. And I think that if our requests for model runs were, not something that fit within what you can do, we'd like to work with you to get our concerns and interests addressed through that process in any way that we can, even if that requires, the offline meetings directly. We're happy to do that. I think that we represent, I believe, the largest customer EPE has. We have resources we would like to provide to, to meet some of the needs that the greater system has, and would like to understand the parameters of doing that, including having generation sited on our installations that provides benefits to us, but that provides power to all of EPE's customers. And I think one of the things that we view as a problem to doing that are transmission constraints. And what we're looking for win-win scenarios or win-win-wins for both EPE, EPE's customers, and our installations to provide system resources that are cost effective to the customers, that meet EPE's needs for New Mexico's requirements, and that provide resiliency to our installations.
Okay, Kyle, we are working with the E3 team to figure out exactly how to model all of this appropriately, but your questions and scenario runs or that topic has actually been turned over to our key accounts group, and they were going to be reaching out to you all directly, but we can shorten up that process. I'll send you a direct message with their contact info. They're reaching out to you also that we can address these specific concerns since it's customer specific.
Understood. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
No problem.
Great. Thank you for your interest and for voicing your concerns and your willingness to help with this challenging situation. So thanks, Kyle. Steve, you have your hand up. Please go ahead. Steve, his hand was up. Steve, are you still there?
Yeah, I was struggling with my mute button. I just wanted to say thank you, I think, for the way that you all have listened to the questions that came forward and your thoughtful approach to putting them together. And I thank you also for the May 6th meeting, for the demand response follow-up. I just wanted to let you guys know that I feel like you and EPE, from what I've heard in this meeting, are being quite responsive, and I appreciate it. So I just wanted to let you know.
Thank you for that, Steve. Appreciate you offering that comment.
Thank you, Steve. We really appreciate that feedback. We are trying this more collaborative approach, so I'm glad to hear that it's working. Again, we welcome all questions, all feedback. This process is for you all. So thank you.
Cynthia, I see you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Margie. And I wanted to just follow on the heels of what Steve said and state that for staff, we're very excited at the direction we're seeing this collaboration on DR and DER evolving. And the way you're talking about consolidating some demand side scenarios is very exciting. Hopefully we'll get something more than just very singular results that amount to, as we've seen in the past with other utilities, not much of anything. And going back to an office hour meeting we had on April 8th, staff's also very excited about the creation energy proposal, which I think is down at slide 67 in the appendix. And that one is, I understand it would be about 500 megawatts in 10 years. And that's the kind of very comprehensive, deep and broad demand side resources that staff wants to see. And we're hoping that we can go beyond having, say, these consolidated demand side scenarios or the creation energy scenario being sensitivities, outside of the base case of EPE, but actually being incorporated and embraced by EPE as their business as usual way forward. And then just beyond this modeling exercise, which is hugely important, the next thing staff would like to get to is developing those actionable items that puts this into implementation. So that is my comments for now. Thank you.
Great. And thanks, Cynthia, for putting the commercial in for action plan conversations, which will happen at later workshops. So keep your ideas handy because those will come up as we work toward an action plan when the modeling is completed, but you don't have to wait to that to be brainstorming about things you think should go into that. So thanks for the keeping people moving forward suggestion. Are there other questions about the approach of handling the requests that came in from stakeholders? We'd really like to hear from anyone, especially if people have concerns about the approach. Please speak up, get support. Anything is welcome. If we don't have more comments, we will go ahead and take our poll and we'll be able to adjourn earlier today. But we want to give time for people who have comments or questions about this approach.
Yes, this is Orland with NMPRC staff. I just wanted to quickly note that I didn't sponsor any of the comments just stated. I'll have to review your comments, Cynthia. Anyway, I am PRC staff, and I'd like to review those comments.
Great. Thanks, Orland, for offering your input to this as well. Thanks. Any other comments or questions? Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I assume these slides are going to be made available to us.
You should already have received them in the meeting announcement that was sent out yesterday, and they are posted on the GridWorks website. So yes, you have access to all those.
Okay, and I was also going to ask that the slides that Ben from E3 reviewed earlier about ELCC, that we get the, those particular slides that were shown. I thought those were very helpful.
I will double check that there's nothing confidential in the rest of the deck, but I think that should be fine.
Great, thank you, Phil. We'll follow up with E3 and we'll post anything that's can be shared broadly. We'll put that on as part of the meeting workshop materials from today.
Margie?
Yeah.
I wanted to circle back to Phil really quick. We did pass on your comments about the market potential study. And our energy efficiency group, our load management group is working on a response to explain exactly how that's all fitting in together. So I can have them reach out to you directly if you like, if you have any more questions, or we can go through Margie and the GridWorks team, whatever is easier for you. But we are addressing your earlier comment.
Okay. Yeah, I think directly would be easier for me, but however you want to do it.
Okay, I'll send you a direct message here.
That would be
Okay,
great,
thank you.
Emmanuel. Thank you. That works for us as well.
Margie, just real quickly, I forgot to mention the appendix in my presentation. So just real quickly, Michelle, if you don't mind just scrolling down, just for your own reviewing pleasure, beginning on slide 51, we have provided responses to each of the stakeholder requests. So you can see your response and then the response to others. These next few slides basically give a response to all of the non-demand side stakeholder requests we received. And then if you just scroll down just real quickly, Michelle, maybe 10 slides or so. When you get to slide 65, then you will see all of the demand side requests. We didn't provide a response to each of these requests for the simple reason is we're obviously consolidating them into the two scenarios I described.
Yeah, thank you, Ben, for pointing that out so that people, the full transparency, so people can read what all the requests included. And we will count on the tremendous experience from E3 and EPE to come to that office hour on May 6th with some possible suggestions about how those scenarios might be organized. So don't feel like you all have to come to that with a consolidated scenario in mind. We'll just be certainly looking for your feedback and conversation about that, those additional scenarios. Nate, go ahead.
I was just going to note that there was a request for the slides or material that Ben was presenting. And I'm going to drop a link. It's from actually a public report that E3 developed, kind of just introducing ELCCs and this approach. So you can read the whole report, and it's probably additional information that could be helpful.
Fabulous. Thanks, Nate. And we'll put that link into the meeting summary, make it accessible as well. So, yeah, thank you. Chris asked about the May 6th meeting. No, we have not sent out an invitation to that office hour yet. We wanted to at least announce it here in the workshop. And my colleague Deborah will be sending out a meeting invitation very shortly. It sounds like there is interest in stakeholders attending that. So we wanted to gauge the interest in that. Sounds like that approach is supported. So we'll send the invitation out. My guess is either today or tomorrow. So it'll be soon.
So just really quick, wanted to make mention in the appendix for these slides as they're available to everyone. You'll notice that we tried to be as thoughtful as we could here and address everyone's concerns, and there's an EP response to each one of those requests. So again, thank you very much for all the feedback. Keep it coming. This has been really, really helpful.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Chris, please go ahead.
Thank you. My question is, am I correct in assuming that the ELCC study is complete for EPE here for this IRP process? And if so, are we going to get the opportunity to see that study in its final form sometime during this process?
Thanks. Oh, go ahead, Ben.
Well, I was just going to actually defer to you, Nate, and just say, have we finalized the study? I think there may be still just a couple of finer points we're putting on it. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. And thanks for the question, Chris. So prior to this current modeling activity, we did conduct, the PRM and ELCC study, and we have completed that analysis for the technologies that we've seen today for the base case, right? We needed those to begin our modeling and understand their contributions. We are updating some minor points of that, as Ben noted, as we add these additional resources that we'd like to explore in the scenarios that are being discussed. So there will be some updates to that. There will be an opportunity or we'll share it as part of kind of our final IRP report contribution, that IRP and ELCC study. But you'll see the additional results as well.
I appreciate it. If I could just make a request, and as soon as it's complete, if you could share it with the group, I think that would be helpful rather than just with the final IRP report, because at least from my perspective, it helps answer a lot of questions that may not be necessary to bring up once we get to the final IRP phase. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, we'll make that as available as soon as we're able to.
And Margie, Chris, I don't know if you saw that, but I did put it in the chat that we would like to see that report as soon as it's available, and agree with you, sooner the better, and it can help answer a lot of questions that we're still sorting through. So thank you.
Okay, we'll be happy to work with E3 and EPE to understand if there are any, if there's proprietary information in it, then that might be, we'll work that out and make sure as soon as it's available that what can be shared will be shared. Great, thank you. Kathy, are you seeing any other topics we need to discuss?
No, I think our chat is clear. Thank you.
Emmanuel or Ben or Nate, is there anything you want to specifically ask about this topic before we take the temperature of our stakeholders?
Nothing
I'm just going to provide one clarification, Margie, and absolutely happy to take this conversation offline with Mr. Brown. But just confirming earlier to the ELCC values for solar, I just want to make it clear the values that Nate were presenting were incremental values. So they're essentially the next megawatt of adding additional solar. So what Nate was essentially presenting is the penetration of solar right now for EPE is pretty much saturated. So as you add additional megawatts of solar to the system, there's lower incremental value because the net peak is now in the evening. That isn't to say that the solar already on the system isn't providing additional reliability analyses, right? Or benefits, excuse me. So the solar that's on the system today absolutely aligns with peak. What we're actually just saying is because the penetration is so high, most of the peak is being taken care of by solar. And as we add incremental solar, the value decreases. So I just want to point out that incremental values.
Great. Thank you, Ben. All right. Well, I would like to ask each of you, except for the EPE and E3 team, you don't need to participate in the poll that we are just about to launch. But we would like to ask all other stakeholders about your level of agreement with the direction the stakeholder requested modeling runs are taking, recognizing we have work to do to define the demand side option scenarios. In the first week in May, we recognize that that's still work that has to be done, and you're welcome to evaluate that at that point. But we would like at this point to let us know whether you are in disagreement or agreement with the approach that's being taken to handle the stakeholder model requests. So Deb, would you please launch the poll, and hopefully those who are on Zoom can see the measurements of the responses there on the screen from strong disagreement number 1 to strong agreement number 5. Feel free to respond to the poll. We'll give it a few moments. We've got 9 people who've responded. Thank you. Please continue to respond. Give it a few more minutes. And it looks like, Deb, if people have problems with the Zoom poll, they can get a QR code. Is that right for responding? Oh, yes. If you need the QR code instead of the Zoom poll, she's got that on her screen. Thank you, Deb. It looks like about 17 of you have responded. That's pretty good. I'll give a couple more minutes for anybody else who'd like to respond on the direction that the model requests are being the handling of the request is being taken. So I don't see any new responses, Deb. So it looks like we've got those responded who can. So let's go ahead and end the poll and share the results. So it looks like we do have a strong strong agreement with 14 of the 17 respondents noting mild or strong agreement. So I think our direction is good, thanks to the thoughtful analysis and experience of the EPE and E3 team for listening and addressing those concerns that people have about modeling. We look forward to the conversation on the 6th about the demand side responses. And we thank you very much for your input on this. This is a very important element of the IRP stakeholder process to understand whether your interests and questions for modeling are being addressed by the utility. And it looks like the approach is supported. So thank you all for responding to that. Don't don't forget your survey skills, because in a moment we're also going to ask you to give us some response on another survey. But before we do that, let's talk about where we've come today. So today's session has been about getting informed about the base case inputs and assumptions that are being used for the modeling. We've also reviewed the scenarios that EPE is going to run in addition to the base case. We've had conversation about the processing of the stakeholder model run requests and the modeling related requests. That approach will now go forward in the modeling activities that EPE and E3 are undertaking in earnest. We will also be meeting in May. What you see on this slide is the calendar for the remaining content-related workshops. So on May 21st and in June 17th, we will continue to digest and understand the results that are coming out of the modeling process. Then in July, 2 workshops are scheduled, one on the 1st and one on the 24th, for us to interpret that result set and start to compose the statement of need and action plan content from the stakeholders. We want to strongly encourage all stakeholders to consider attending the July 24th hybrid workshop in Las Cruces if you can. We will have a Zoom option for that, but as many of you know, that may not be a very satisfying interaction for some. So if you can attend in person, we'd love to host you there in Las Cruces on July 24th. So with that, let me ask if there are any questions of stakeholders, and then I'll ask if there's any additional announcements from Kathy and Deb. And of course, the last word gets to come from EPE and Emmanuel and Judy if they have any comments. So let me first open it to ask if there are any questions that the stakeholders have of what we've covered and where we're going, what's next. Go ahead, Kyle, please.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about the May 6th demand side, or
Yep.
PSM meeting that we're going to have. And are there going to be separate meetings for the breakup in between the large customers and residential customers, or is it going to be one meeting?
I think our plan is to conduct one meeting and to cover both scenarios, one for the residential and one for the commercial and industrial, but have the conversations in one session because they may overlap. But Ben, let me turn to you and Nate and Emmanuel for any clarification about how you see that conversation occurring.
Yeah, my thought, Margie, we were just going to have one meeting to cover the 2 options. Happy to present, demand response for C&I first, and maybe try and get that one resolved, and people can drop, and the people interested in the residential can stay on, if that's helpful.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, thanks. Other questions? All right, if you please, Deb, go to the next slide, and let me give you and Kathy any other opportunities to add comments. As I mentioned, we will be posting a written summary from this workshop on the website, and the following workshop, workshop 5, will be May 21st by Zoom. But as you know, we're at workshop number 4. We're halfway through this process, and GridWorks and EPE would very much appreciate your taking a few minutes when we close this meeting to respond to a survey, either through the link on this slide or the QR code on your screen, and give us feedback about anything you think needs to be done differently as we're going through the rest of this process. Your feedback is extremely important, and it helps us design a process that's the best for all parties. So please don't hesitate to be critical. If there's something you think needs to be changed, please let us know. So we'll leave this up while I give Kathy and Deb first the opportunity to make any other comments or announcements, and then we'll turn to the EPE team for their closing comments before we end. Kathy, go ahead.
Yeah, no, nothing further from me. I'll just say thank you to everybody for your time and constructive contributions. And boy, I tell you, I've been really impressed with the New Mexico way here, that you folks are very constructive and bring lots of good ideas to the table and work it through together. And that's really nice to see. So thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Deb, is there anything we need to remind our stakeholders about?
No, just wanted to let you know, though, that we will have meeting summary out tomorrow, and I will also get out Zoom invitations to the May 6th and May 21st meetings. That'll be coming in the next, this afternoon or tomorrow.
Great. Thanks, Deborah. Emmanuel and Judy, is there anything else that you would like to offer before we close today's workshop?
Just again, thank you everybody for your time and all of the feedback. I can't stress it enough that it is vital to the process here. So please don't be shy about speaking up or reaching out. It only helps us make the process better. And we look forward to that May 6th meeting so that we can just keep the conversation going. This is great. Thank you. We really appreciate it.
Excellent. Great. I see we have a question from someone about the link. Deb, can you put the link to the survey in the chat, please?
Sure.
That would be fabulous. It's Alan is asking, yes. So Alan, Deb's going to put the link to the survey here in chat. So give her just a few minutes and she'll put that in so that you should be able to copy it directly from the chat. Can you access? Yes, you can access the chat because I see you put a note in. Great. Good. Okay, you got it. Deb, that survey, we'll leave that survey open through the close of business today. So if you can get any comments in today, that would be super helpful because we will be processing that to help design the rest of the process. If people have strong feelings that they want a bit more time to do that, just let Deborah know, and we certainly will take your input. But the more we can get in the next 24 hours, the better. So great. Thanks, Deborah. All right. Well, we will leave this up as we close the meeting here today. Hopefully you can productively use a little extra time this afternoon. And again, a huge thank you to all our stakeholders for your thoughtful engagement. The questions offline as well and discussions have been super helpful. We have a big appreciation for EPE and the E3 team and the way they've thoughtfully prepared materials and done the analysis. So thank you to everyone for your time and your productive engagement. And we will see you
Margie, I
again.
just realized I had a quick question. I added several more questions to the chat.
Thank you.
On the first session, and so I assume EP will be able to get back to me on that, or get back to the entire group. I hope my questions are relevant for everyone.
Cynthia, I'm sorry, you dropped that in the chat today, or you're referring to the
No,
past
I
workshop?
put all of this in the chat today, as you know, when we broke from the first session to the second. I just sat here and wrote out the rest of my questions that I had. They should be here in the chat.
I haven't seen those come through. Is it something you could just drop in an email to us?
Okay, I'll have to remember my questions again.
So Cynthia, my understanding was that Orland would like an opportunity to interact with you on those before they get formally submitted. That was my understanding from hearing from Orland.
Oh, okay. I just thought he disagreed with my comment at the end of the meeting. So,
Oh,
you know, I don't see no
I just
questions.
want to reserve the right for staff to be able to review those comments, Cynthia. So thank you all for your stakeholder engagement process. We appreciate it. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Thank
All
you.
right, I'll get it taken care of. Don't worry.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. And we will end the recording now. Deborah, feel free to end the recording. We will leave this slide up in case anyone still likes the information.